Are you part of a local nonprofit organization? Want some help getting your message out? Consider a public service announcement with Asheville FM on WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville and on the internet at ashevillefm.org. A public service announcement is a great way to gain exposure for your organization or cause while supporting positive change in your community. If you have an existing PSA, get it to us and we'll get it on the air. Interested but need some assistance? We're here to help. Contact us at psa@ashevillefm.org or go to ashevillefm.org for more information.
The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show.
You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. The shows can also be heard on KWTF in Bodega Bay, California, KOWA-LP in Olympia, Washington, WCRS-LP in Columbus, Ohio, and newly on KWRK-LP in Fairbanks, Alaska. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just send us an email so we can say hey. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week, our episode features one interview. We're speaking with James, who is an anti-fascist and anti-repression organizer, currently based out of Texas. James will be speaking about the incoming Trump administration, liberal presumptions around the deep state saving us from such a thing, Russian interventions into our elections, the autonomous right, and how we can resist both the incoming administration, hopefully future administrations, as well as the autonomous far right and alt-right. More information on these topics can be found at threewayfight.blogspot.ca, also at antifascistnews.net, and there's also a recent good resource list published at itsgoingdown.org under the title Trump the Regime, Resources Ongoing Resistance, Trump Far Right. Also, I'm kind of recording this on the fly, so there have been a number of updates on prisoner situations in the U.S., including the commutation, at least, of Chelsea Manning and the commutation of Oscar Lopez Rivera. More on these subjects can be found at denverabc.wordpress.com or nycabc.wordpress.com. If you're in the Asheville area on Sunday the 27th at 7 p.m., at Firestorm Books and Coffee, there will be a film showing in support of the International Day of Support for and Action for Trans Prisoners, and this is put on by Transmission Prison Project. So we're speaking with James. James is involved in anti-fascist organizing and anti-repression organizing and is currently residing in Texas. Thanks so much for the surprise conversation, James.
No problem. That's my pleasure.
So there's been a lot of talk among RADs, among anarchists and autonomists, of anti-fascist organizing over the last year and a half. And in particular, things have been ramping up in relation to the elections as Donald Trump has come to the fore and got the nomination and actually was elected president in whatever way he was. And I've noticed in the past that people on the left and anarchists who don't consider themselves on the left sometimes will use the term fascist in a loose way to like accuse anyone they disagree with of being this certain tendency if they have a more right-leaning perspective. Can you talk about your perspectives on is Trump a fascist, or where does the fascist creep, other than that fascist creep, like where does the fascist creep come into it? Why is fascism a thing to organize against?
I guess there's a couple questions there. The first one that I don't really have a definitive answer to is whether or not Trump himself is a fascist. I think there's definitely strong elements of fascism, fascist tendencies to his campaign, to his ascendancy. And I think there's, also some strong, caveats to that, he hasn't really been mobilizing any sort of paramilitary force specifically. There's not a whole like non-state apparatus that he's been sort of mobilizing, coalescing, and organizing the way that we often see from more traditional fascist movements. Now, whether or not that's a defining feature of fascism or not is, something that's quite open to debate. And, I think it gets to more fundamental questions about what exactly is fascism. And I think this is, an area where the left has struggled and somewhat stagnated for a significant period of time in terms of theorizing and analyzing fascism and how it relates to general modes of authoritarian nationalist capitalism, but also how it relates to the radical revolutionary left. And I don't want to, I'm not here to give a full explanation of fascism, what it is, what it isn't, the history of it. But the sort of one point that I think is important for people to consider is that fascism isn't always aligned with the state. There's sort of this idea that dates back to some old Leninist ideas that fascism is sort of something that the capitalist ruling class resorts to in a period of crisis, and that this is just one more mode of capitalist control. But I think that there's a lot of research and a lot of theorizing that fascism in a way is itself sometimes often revolutionary in terms of overthrowing current methods of state control, instituting new ideas of what the social order should be like. I prefer to refer to fascism's insurgent nature, that it's sometimes contra or against the state and typical ruling class interests. And I think what we're seeing right now is sort of some hybrid of that. Obviously, Donald Trump has a lot of institutional support. Donald Trump himself is, a billionaire real estate media mogul. He's not by any means, something against the current prevailing order. But a lot of the sentiment that he's mobilized and capitalized on is against that prevailing order in some ways. I think a lot of his campaign was based in a strong reaction against the past couple decades of neoliberalism, austerity programs, economic structural adjustment, all the forces that have, globalized the economy, cut social programs, sent jobs, overseas, or even out of the old bastions of industrial unionism in the United States. Those are sort of, some of the reactions that Trump is mobilizing, and it's, somewhat parallel to what Bernie Sanders was doing also. And so I think a big part of Trump's ascendancy and his success is evidence of this sort of mass break with the prevailing, economic, social norms that Hillary Clinton, represented to a T. She was the candidate that was, running on the platform of basically continuing the status quo that clearly isn't working for a lot of people. And so in that sense we can discern a more radical tendency in a lot of Trump's support and a lot of his rise to power. The other crucial component here is that, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump himself is a fascist or not, his campaign, his staff, the people around him, and his success are, very intimately and dynamically connected with actual overt fascism. Fascists have been cheering Donald Trump's candidacy and his rise to power since his campaign took off, since he announced his candidacy and his intent to build a wall between Mexico. Um, his one of his very first cabinet appointments was Steve Bannon, the self-proclaimed voice of the alt-right. I think he called Breitbart News the platform of the alt-right, which is this sort of somewhat more recent hybrid and dressed up form of neo-fascism or quasi-fascism. And so that's the person that's, got Donald Trump's ear. There's a lot of overt fascists that I think have a voice in the White House now. And I think, fascism, the grassroots fascism that, maybe isn't quite as entrenched in institutions and the ruling class, I think they have a lot of momentum and enthusiasm behind their movement right now. And, there's several threats that this poses to, radical liberatory organizing. The obvious threat is this sort of physical threat that, that, attacks on protesters, attacks on radical spaces, attacks on communities of color, Muslim communities, Jewish communities. We're seeing since the election and even before the election, we've seen this pretty steady and pretty dramatic uptick in this extra legal violence from the far right. And this isn't something that began with Trump. We've seen this sort of building for several years now. You go back to even before the Malheur occupation in Oregon last year. We had the Bundy ranch occupation back in 2014. Increasing threats and violence against Black Lives Matter protesters across the country. This sort of reaction to Black autonomy and organizing, and so this sort of ascendant fascism was coming for us regardless of Trump, but Trump has definitely sped it up and emboldened it. The other sort of threat that it poses to radical organizing is more of a political threat. To the extent that fascism is insurgent and is, sort of revolutionary and channels a lot of discontent with the status quo, that's discontent that is being funneled into a, racial nationalist framework for really authoritarian and oppressive ends, instead of discontent that's being channeled into the struggle against the state and capitalism and for, equality, freedom, and liberation for all of us. And so I think that's, sort of a big failing of the left that, when industrial workers in the Midwest get fed up with neoliberalism, they're more willing to turn to, Donald Trump waving the white nationalist flag, somewhat implicitly, somewhat explicitly, instead of running to anti-capitalist unions or the class struggle, as the case may have been. And I think there's certain historical reasons for that regarding the legacy of settler colonialism in the U.S. and how the so-called white working class has often deferred their class interests for what they perceive to be their racial interests. But I also think there's certain failings of the left in that regard, to either politically move that constituency or politically restrain that constituency, to either bring them to our side or to organize a strong enough force to say that you will find no answers in this white nationalist framework, and you will be fought tooth and nail every step of the way.
Just to jump back and not to lead the conversation astray, but at one point you were talking about near the beginning of that statement about paramilitarism and that being lacking in the current administration. But then again, like The Intercept just recently, Jeremy Scahill published an article talking about Eric Prince, who is the founder of the private security firm formerly known as Blackwater. It's gone through a few different names, Z, and I'm not sure what they're currently calling themselves. But who were responsible for the Nisar Square massacre, and has expressed a perspective of struggling against Islamic groups or Islamist groups in Africa, in Asia, and in West Asia, basically the Middle East, with a perspective of kind of a crusader position, which would seem to fulfill a little bit of that, like, hey, so private industry, mercenaries aiding and abetting the current administration, maybe? Or does that seem like a bit of a stretch or presumption?
Well, I guess I'll say two things about it. One, I mean, the possibility of sort of a paramilitary force supplementing the state with Trump's rise to power has always been and remains a possibility. Just because we haven't seen it yet doesn't mean that it won't emerge. I also read that Trump is planning to maintain his private security detail despite having Secret Service protection. And in terms of security protection, it's hard to imagine something more robust and complete than having full Secret Service protection. But despite that, Trump feels the need to maintain a private security detail.
Well, also imagine in that scenario a security detail that is not directly responsible to the interests of the public or to public censure because it's a private industry. That's why I would imagine that he would be more in line with having his own security people, because he's paying them directly. They're not professionals who have gone up through whatever assumptions or standards the administrations in the past have had, and he can just tell them to, like, yeah, you didn't see that, don't worry about it. And they don't have an ethical, quote unquote, standard to uphold the Constitution as a part of their job.
Right. I mean, I would never bank too hard on law enforcement's ethical standards of upholding the Constitution or anybody's constitutional rights. In some ways, I actually think that a private security force in that context would be perhaps more restrained in some regards than the Secret Service. I think the Secret Service is in many ways somewhat legally immune to liability for a lot of what they do. If they beat some protesters at a Trump event or something, I don't think there's too many courts that would give a lawsuit too much leeway in terms of suing the Secret Service. I could be wrong about that, but I actually think there is potentially more liability for private actors or private security force in that regard. But I think part of me thinks that's a little bit neither here nor there. In terms of what, how liability or public censure or public accountability might go. The other, some of the other things that we've seen have been, this sort of more grassroots and autonomous organizing in support of Donald Trump and defending his movement. I can't remember the name of one group. It was called something like Lions Guard or something that was, I'm not sure if it was ever much more than sort of a Facebook group, but, people that were pledging to, come out and, fight protesters in defense of Trump at his rallies and things of that sort. Most recently, he was tweeting and talking about bikers for Trump that were going to be at his inauguration to, be a sort of additional security force against protesters and dissidents. But despite some of those musings, there hasn't been. I haven't seen a significant manifestation of that. There's been incidents of violence, no doubt, but in terms of having some sort of organized, dedicated force to, the extra legal repression side of things, I haven't seen that a whole lot. The issue of sort of private mercenary armies, also raises that specter in a number of ways. That for the most part, we've seen these sort of private mercenary contractors being employed overseas, Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, places of that sort. But there were some instances of Blackwater personnel being deployed in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so that sort of, the war zone that was New Orleans and the occupation that was New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina parallels a lot of those situations overseas. And we see how, the National Guard, but also Blackwater, is brought in to restore quote unquote order to that situation. I think the trajectory of conflict right now internationally is, definitely one that's leaning towards proxy wars and privatized armies. The powers that are actually struggling with each other aren't always directly struggling with each other. We see that a lot in Syria right now, that, there's a whole bunch of different sides there that are in conflict and struggle with one another. But, there's not Russian troops on the ground. There's not Iranian troops on the ground in Syria. There's not U.S. troops on the ground for the most part. There's, special ops that are there and sort of covert advisor roles, but it's not, an all-out ground war between the U.S. and Russia at this point. It's sort of a proxy war being fought through, the Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime, various Kurdish forces, Turkey, various airstrikes from various superpowers. So it's not, it's a lot more of this proxy fight going on. And also, the use of, privatized military forces like Blackwater and all the, further iterations. I also don't remember the name of Eric Prince's new venture that's, I think, based out of Hong Kong now. One sort of wonders to what extent he's trying to escape various legal liabilities in the U.S. By basing his new operations overseas.
I don't think it takes very much imagination.
Right. So, that is sort of the trajectory of future conflict, I think, is, these really complicated, multi-sided struggles where there's not necessarily one clear side that we can get behind, or there's a lot of different sides with competing interests that are embroiled in a what we call a multipolar conflict. Proxy struggles, and then privatized militaries using mercenary labor, basically. But I don't know that having, to the extent that that's restricted to the overseas sort of theaters, I guess. I don't know if that's necessarily a harbinger of paramilitary control at home. It could be, possibly, but this is something that's been going on for almost 2 decades now under two different presidential regimes, first Bush and then Obama, to a lesser but not completely absent extent. So I don't know if that is really a huge shift or if it's more just an expansion of what was already there.
Yeah, it seems to carry the hallmarks of neoliberal policy in general. Uh, so, well, so for bringing it back to the home front, a lot of people who are unsettled by the election of Donald Trump and the rise in reactionary politics at home have attempted from their various positions to question or to bring into question the legitimacy of the election, whether to be talking about the percentage of the population that actually voted Hillary versus Trump, the legitimacy of the Electoral College, questions about actually doing vote counts like Jill Stein was trying to do through a bunch of the different states that Trump had succeeded in, and sort of play his own game at saying that there was vote rigging going on, to questions about foreign intervention in the elections, and a pushing from the Russians to specifically collect information from both the RNC and the DNC, but only release information that could be negative about the DNC, while also potentially, ostensibly, if any of this is to be trusted, because of this game of shells that is politics anymore, the holding of a videotape that shows Trump in compromising positions. Don't let your imagination go too far with that. You might end up sick. What do you think? What do you think realistically America can do, or Americans can do to resist this election, or and what do you think about these methods that liberals and leftists and centrists and other conservatives have been taking to delegitimize the election?
I'll just go ahead and say it. I think it's a total mess. And I think in some ways it feels like a big sort of sideshow. I don't know what role Russia had in the election. It's pretty clear what role the Electoral College had in the election. That, absent the Electoral College, these results would not have happened. It's pretty clear that Hillary got 3 million more votes than Trump. But I go back to sort of what I said a little while ago, that regardless of Trump, whether or not Trump got elected, the problems that we're facing now are problems that we would have been facing anyway. I think for certain strategic reasons, it would have been preferable for the left to face those problems under a democratic regime. I tend to think that when there's a Democrat in power, and people get disillusioned with a Democrat, they find their outlets for that in radical politics. We saw that under Clinton, how the way that the anti-globalization movement really just blew up under his presidency, because here's a sort of liberal centrist Democrat, and once you're feeling sold out by that, the next place to go is something more radical, more fundamental than that. When there's a Republican in power, people that tend to lean either a little bit or a lot of bit to the left get into this we have to elect somebody else next time. And I think a lot more energy gets channeled into electoral politics in that way. We saw that back in 2003, 2004 under President Bush, when the entire left got caught up in this sort of anybody but Bush campaign. You had avowed radicals that were out there plugging for John Kerry, probably one of the most, again, milquetoast candidates that the Democratic Party could have come up with at that time. And we sort of see how just how disastrous that was, that all that effort got put into trying to elect John Kerry, and what do we get? 4 more years of President Bush. And so it's sort of, I feel like in a lot of ways, a tremendous amount of wasted effort and wasted energy there. And I'm afraid that's going to happen again, that a lot of people are going to focus on, we've got to get a, Democratic majority in the House during the midterm elections, and we got to make sure we elect a Democrat in, the in the next election cycle. And it's pretty clear the Democratic Party hasn't really learned any lessons from what happened this last election. That let's keep reelecting the same leadership to the Democratic Party. Keep doing the same thing. Keep running to the center. Keep with these really just uninspiring and sort of party hack candidates. I think, I really think that the right and, quite frankly, the fascist right outmaneuvered the entire sort of establishment left in this past election. There was a quote from Milo Yiannopoulos, the sort of fascist alt-right speaker who's sort of notorious for being a troll on the internet. But the quote of his that I read about sort of the election cycle, that, by the time you get to policy positions, I've already lost interest. By the time you're talking about, specific proposals, you've already lost. And I think that was, sadly, one of the more astute things that I read about, the election and commentary on the election, coming from a, pretty overt fascist. But I think it encapsulates a lot of what happened, that, Donald Trump was capturing people's imaginations, albeit in a very reactionary and oppressive way, whereas Hillary Clinton was, talking, policy minutia and running on the status quo and promising to keep doing the same things that people were, very clearly upset about. And so I think the left has a lot of lessons to be learned from that. And I don't, it's not clear, especially from the sort of liberal centrist left, whether or not any of those lessons are being learned. The issue of Russian hacking, I think it goes back to this question that, our movements seem somewhat theoretically incapable of dealing with these sort of multifaceted, multipolar conflicts that are, increasingly taking center stage. That a lot of the left responses that I've seen to this are, one, people that are just sort of smugly being like, ha ha ha, CIA accused Russia of hacking and intervening in the election. CIA's been doing that for decades, which, that's true, but that's also not exactly a helpful observation in terms of moving anybody forward. Plenty of other people are sort of up in arms about this Russian hacking thing and saying that, the CIA needs to overturn the election, or the Electoral College needs to overturn the election, sort of this fantasy of what they call the deep state sort of intervening at the last minute to save us from, this nightmare that I think we all, at least to some extent, had a hand in creating. And I think, that's, at least as frightening to me as a Trump presidency, having, the CIA determine who gets to be president. That, has, one, that's sort of fundamentally undemocratic, and two, has, really scary implications moving forward. At the end of the day, I don't know how much it matters for us in terms of concrete action. At the end of the day, I can't control what Russia does. I can't control what the CIA does. I can't control what the Electoral College does. But what I can control, is, the relationships that I'm building in my community, with the people around me, the sort of movement that I'm building, the power that I can help build from below, that would, hopefully at some point make the CIA, the Electoral College, Russia, Donald Trump, whoever else, a little bit obsolete, a little bit less of a driver in what's controlling, what's driving our lives.
Or a lot obsolete.
Hopefully, more and more. At this point, God, I'd settle for just a little bit.
This is the Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. We're speaking with James, who is an anti-fascist and anti-repression organizer, currently based out of Texas. Well, so I think that brings us to an interesting point in the conversation so if the deep state isn't going to save us, and if their idea of saving us means giving us, although albeit a somewhat ostensibly or seemingly progressive status quo, a status quo that has begun giving lip service to mass incarceration of people of color, of like death on the streets at the hands of the police, with an utter lack of regard from the legal system and towards any sort of justice for those folks. The war on drugs being a failure, all these things that the left and radicals have been able to get into more and more into more mainstream discussion. If the deep state isn't going to save us, and if saving us would mean kind of throwing us into a slow boiling pot with that anyway, what's the alternative? What sort of organizing, as you sort of seem to be pointing to, like what sort of community organizing are you looking forward to, and are you interested in engaging with and proposing that folks engage with?
I think the sky is really the limit there. There's sort of a phrase being thrown around that I've seen a lot in terms of being ungovernable. And I think that has a lot of resonance with people right now in terms of, especially under the Trump regime, that, this illegitimate power is not going to control us, is not going to dictate us, and we're going to, determine our own destinies according to our own values and interests. And so, there's any number of issues that I think are extremely important. I think, immigration and migrant defense is a huge issue. A lot of cities and local officials and universities and stuff have signed on to this idea of being sanctuary cities, which is, a really encouraging start. It's a very, very good place to start from. But I think there's a lot to build on there also, in terms of really making certain places into sanctuaries, beyond just sort of a passive sanctuary, which is, a lot of what this is. That, certain institutions, police departments, whatever, aren't going to affirmatively inquire into somebody's immigration status, but when that immigration warrant comes down from ICE, that that jail is still probably going to detain that person until they're taken into ICE custody, and so it doesn't. It's a step in the right direction, but I think there's a lot more that we can push for in terms of encouraging non-cooperation and non-collaboration with the immigration, deportation, immigrant detention machinery. Obviously, anti-repression work in all varieties is going to be really important. Forming networks of legal support, sympathetic lawyers that can, help both on the criminal and the civil side. Building support for political prisoners, people that get arrested and incarcerated for their political activities. I think is extremely important. Inculcating our movements with the really vast amount of knowledge that we have at our disposal about the history of political repression, how that repression has been enacted on movements, how movements have responded both successfully and not successfully, I think is really important in building that education. I think that's really important foundational framework for getting new people involved. And this is our baseline, that if you're going to be involved in this resistance, you cannot be a collaborator. And, obviously there's degrees of collaboration, but, I think we need to set a pretty stiff line on that in terms of, you can't be a resistor if you're a collaborator. There's, no middle ground there. The other big area that we've seen a lot of activity in is, explicit anti-fascist organizing, in terms of, organizing to confront the more autonomous grassroots fascist groups that are mobilizing out there with the momentum that they've gotten from Trump's election. We've seen, like I've mentioned Milo earlier, the sort of fascist alt-right Twitter troll, has been doing a series of college campus tours that have sparked more mobilization than I've seen in a long time, in terms of not giving him a platform to spew his fascist rhetoric and to spew his sort of somewhat exterminationist agenda. And so organizing of that nature, or outing some of these fascist personalities. The guy that went by Mike Enoch, who ran a fascist anti-Semitic radio show, was recently what they called doxed. Basically his real name and information was made public so that he couldn't sort of hide in the shadows about who he was and what he was doing. And that's created some pretty significant divisions and discord within various fascist circles as a result of that. I think part of it was that he had this radio show where he was advocating genocide against Jewish people, and then it was revealed that his wife is actually Jewish. And so I think that's caused a lot of discord and infighting within those fascist circles. And the more that they're fighting with each other, the less that they're fighting with other people. So I think that sort of disruption is also hugely important. And there's a lot of people that have been doing really good sort of sleuthing and intelligence work in that regard, that translates to real victories for our movement. So I think those are obviously all areas that are going to be extremely important. I also think it's really important to not stop the other work that we've been doing. The anti-police work and organizing that had been going on for a number of years, particularly since Ferguson, extremely important. I always like to say that, all cops are Trump supporters. Um, Most every major police union in the country endorsed Trump's presidency, his candidacy, and it's not Donald Trump that's going to, crush our protests. He's not going to deport a single person himself. It's cops of varying stripes that are going to do that. And so I think, the struggle against Donald Trump is also the struggle against the police, the struggle against, capitalist social relations, the way we relate to each other based on, these ideas of money and profit. So I think there's a lot to be said for the work that we've already been doing. I think we have to be, particularly diligent and particularly careful about it moving forward. I think, repression is going to increase. And a friend of mine made some remark that, my fear is that it's going to get a whole lot more blatant, a lot more extreme. And I have that fear also, but sort of another fear that I have is that, it gets more extreme without getting more blatant. In this day and age, they don't need to build a new concentration camp for a couple thousand, radical leftists. They just, arrest us on some bullshit, run us through some, sort of railroaded show trials, and then we go to prison and look like we're sort of ordinary social prisoners to a lot of the public. So I think, the machinery of a lot of this repression is already in place. And I'm not sure, my biggest fear is that it doesn't necessarily look that different from what we've seen before, that it's, different in degree and, different in severity, but to the casual outside observer, that nothing really changes. And, I read something somewhere that, frankly, a lot of authoritarianism is kind of boring and kind of tolerable for a lot of people. If you're willing to keep your head down, not make a fuss, and, go along to get along, a lot of people, won't necessarily, have a significant problem under an authoritarian Trump regime. And, those are obviously people with, a lot of privilege and a lot of cowardice. And I think it's important that we, do our best to inoculate as many people as we can from that sort of go along to get along mentality, and, really cherish what it is that we felt on November 10th, the sort of horror and outrage and just sort of sick feeling, and remember why we felt that, and, let that burning passion, drive our activity going forward, because it's going to be an uphill fight. It's not going to be easy, but it's a fight that we really can't shy away from. And I think, it's going to take all of us. We're going to have to find ways to work with each other and build alliances with people that, we might not always like, and, build solidarity around, mutual support for each other that doesn't involve throwing each other under the bus, doesn't involve, denouncing other people for their tactics, doesn't involve, trying to seek some advantage over the denigration and marginalization of other participants in the resistance. But I think, if we can do that, if we can really work to build something with the silver lining of an opportunity that we have here, then, I think the future really is up for grabs.
In the last few minutes, I wonder if you could, there's a lot of other questions that I want to ask, but this is only an hour-long episode, so hopefully in the near future we can have more conversations like this. I would love that.
Definitely.
But, so, do you have any, closing thoughts on how we, as we're working to organize in these communities and organizing with the people around us who come from a varied number of different perspectives, whether they be non-participation in politics, whether they be just disaffected Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Greens or whatever, or I guess what I'm kind of getting at, people that may seem in some ways to be of the same ilk, organizations that might seem to be of the same ilk, people that are helping to organize some of the protests in the cities around the country, including in DC, the party left, the Marxist left. I'm wondering if you have ideas about holding the position while resisting too much overlap with the state, how we also continue to have positions of pushing for community autonomy outside of Marxist-Leninist vanguard party formations that are organizing at the same time in college campuses among like immigration solidarity movements and all these other things with the intention of building a party structure that can eventually enter into the mainstream political fray in the US.
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question.
Well, I kind of feel like, so there's momentum and there's power that we organize in our communities when we're trying to directly affect, like, and build networks of solidarity to affect issues around like decreasing healthcare or lack of access to reproductive healthcare, for instance, or when we talk about like building affinity and creating on the ground networks of solidarity that maybe could do something that might look like resisting immigration raids or stop and frisk or increased police repression against marginalized communities, these sorts of things, or offering safe spaces to folks that are facing specific repression. And I feel like there are institutional left parties in the U.S. that maybe are not as powerful as they have been, or they are in other countries, but the RCP or the ISO or other institutions that are working to try to build a formalized party structure and taking the disaffection that people are feeling and their anti-racism and their feminism and all these like strong feelings that we have inside of ourselves that I think are very positive, and redirecting the energy towards creating something that works to co-opt this disaffection and this rebellion into something that would eventually participate in the political structure of the United States. Does this make sense, what I'm saying?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think the short answer is that we just have to be better organizers. We have to, have better propaganda. We have to have, a sharper and more appealing political analysis. And I think another big thing is that we have to have ways to plug in new people. I think a lot of these more traditional Marxist groups are really good about, somebody comes and they'd be like, I want to be involved. And they're like, okay, you want to be involved? You can start by, reading this book by Lenin, and then you can come to our study group, and then, we'll put you in, selling newspapers or, doing X, Y, and Z. They sort of have a program. And I don't think that, the anti-authoritarian left, anarchists and anti-authoritarian communists and such, I don't think that we need to be, having a program necessarily. But when people come to us and be like, I'm pissed off, I'm upset, I want to get involved, we can't just, look at them and be like, oh, well, I don't know, maybe like follow this Facebook group or like, I don't know, do a thing. Because I feel like that's sort of been a lot of our response. And I've felt that myself when people are like, I want to get involved in something. What can I do? And I'm like, so I think we need to be a whole lot better about saying like, here are some concrete things that you can do to get involved. And I think, a lot of us that have been involved in these sort of politics for, 5, 10, 20 years, sometimes forget what it was to be, that brand new organizer or that brand new activist with that sort of budding sense of urgency and desire to do something about it. And we want everybody to, come into it with the same, political analysis and same sort of discerning approach that we've developed over, 5, 10, or 20 years. And I don't think that that's realistic. And I think, we need to find ways that are supportive and encouraging of people, help people along through their political development. I think, during times of struggle, people, politicize and radicalize a whole lot faster but not if we, start off by being super self-righteous and super sort of condescending and alienating and unsupportive about, new people getting involved. And, doesn't mean that every person that's like, hey, I want to get involved in something, like, you don't want to put that person in your direct action affinity group immediately, because, there's problems with that also. But I think we need better ways to say, like, here's a thing that you can do to get involved, start meeting people, see what's going on, and not having just one thing, but having multiple options for people that are a little bit more direct and concrete, because not everybody wants to write letters to prisoners, or not everybody wants to go to a protest necessarily. And so I think the more ways that we can find to plug in people that are interested in this work and interested in these ideas and these causes, the better that will be. And I think the more exciting and vibrant and welcoming we can make all that, the better we'll be able to compete with some of these groups that sort of want to build a cult of personality around their Marxist father figure, or whatever else, and recruit people just to sell newspapers for them about why Russia is the holy savior of Syria or something. So there's definitely a lot of risk of people getting a lot of this energy getting co-opted into more forms of authoritarianism, whether it's campaigning for Joe Biden to run for president next time, or whether it's reading 27 books by Bob Avakian about obscure Marxist theory. I think that we can and are able to do better than that, and I think that we can offer people more empowering, more exciting options for how to get involved. But I think we have to think about it and be intentional about it, so we're not just sort of stuck navel gazing when people ask us how they can get involved.
Well, thank you so much, James. I'm sorry to cut right there. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I, again, look forward to chatting more in the future.
Definitely, and I appreciate the opportunity.
You're awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Yeah, no problem.
You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Versa Goodness. The shows can also be heard on KWTF in Bodega Bay, California, KOWA-LP in Olympia, Washington, WCRS-LP in Columbus, Ohio, and newly on KWRK-LP in Fairbanks, Alaska. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just send us an email so we can say hey. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week, our episode features one interview. We're speaking with James, who is an anti-fascist and anti-repression organizer, currently based out of Texas.